All right, we'll get started as folks continue to join. Um, Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all to this webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague Haley Robe. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate and other environmental changes, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our recordings on our website. I'll put that link in a moment in chat. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will be able to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A. We will end the formal part of this webinar at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to engage in a more informal conversation with our speaker is encouraged to do so. And now I'm super excited to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Kira Clark-Wolf. Kira is a research scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder, and a co-lead ecologist for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. She's physically located in Logan, Utah. Kira's research integrates perspectives from paleoecology, fire ecology, and climate change adaptation science to advance the understanding of ecological transformation. Her current work centers on generating actionable science to inform resource management planning under uncertainty about future climate and ecological responses across the North Central US. Before joining the North Central CASC, Kira led research characterizing fire climate ecosystem interactions over centuries to millennia in Rocky Mountain subalpine forests using lake sediment records. Kira received her PhD in systems ecology from the University of Montana. The title for today's webinar is Ecological Scenarios, Embracing Ecological Uncertainty for Climate Change Adaptation. Kira, thank you, and please take it away.
Thank you, Imtiaz. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. This project has been in the works for several years now, and I'm excited to get to share out about our work on ecological scenarios. I want to start off with some acknowledgements before I get started here, including our project team, Wynn Moss, Imtiaz Rangwala, Brian Miller, and Helen Sofair, as well as our many co-authors and collaborators who informed this work, our NC-CASC team, and our funders at the USGS. I'd also like to note that this project builds on a large body of work in the scenario planning world that far predates my entry into this topic. This work really would not have been possible without those prior efforts, so I want to acknowledge that wider community of researchers and practitioners in this field. Okay, let's get into it. As we are all probably aware, we're increasingly experiencing the effects of climate change, including rising temperatures and increases in weather extremes and associated disturbances like droughts, heat waves, floods, and wildfires. And as the climate changes, ecological systems are increasingly experiencing transformations or significant lasting shifts in multiple characteristics of an ecosystem, from terrestrial to marine, and the tropics to the Arctic. A number of examples are highlighted here from the 5th National Climate Assessment Report. One of those that's prominent here in the Western US is shifts from dry forest to shrubby or grass-dominated vegetation, catalyzed by a combination of severe fires and post-fire drought conditions. And so, in this context, where current and future ecosystems may increasingly look and function very differently from what we see historically, natural resource management faces new challenges. Rather than managing for historical conditions, as has been the more kind of traditional paradigm, climate adaptation seeks to reduce harmful impacts and take advantage of new opportunities as conditions change, often requiring shifts in management goals, objectives, and strategies. And climate adaptation planning, often following kind of a generalized planning cycle like this one, really relies on science and information about the potential impacts of climate change to inform decisions about how to manage ecosystems in light of changing conditions, motivating attention on methods for characterizing the range of plausible futures. One such approach is scenario planning, which has emerged as a way to contend with significant unknowns about the future, including the pace and magnitude of climate change, ecological responses to those changes in climate, and interactions with non climate stressors. Rather than focusing on the most probable outcome, as in forecasting, scenario based adaptation recognizes that there may be multiple ways things could go. And by exploring the full range of responses, we can help to support decisions under uncertainty. This can be really helpful for managers, not only to understand how the ecosystems they manage might change, but to think creatively and strategically about management interventions. Specifically, planners can test possible adaptation actions against different scenarios to identify which strategies are no-brainers, things we're already doing that are likely to continue to be effective, no-gainers that may be maladaptive under future conditions, and no-regret strategies that are robust to uncertainty or can confer resilience across a range of future conditions. There may also be opportunities to identify proactive ways to address risks from highly impactful possibilities. So these are some of the benefits of scenarios, but what makes a useful scenario and what is the current state of practice for their creation and use in informing management decisions? As scenario-based approaches have been increasingly used to support adaptation planning, there's been a large effort to develop systematic methods for representing uncertainty in future climate. This is an example from Wind Cave National Park, demonstrating this approach of selecting climate projections that capture a wide range of plausible future conditions. What we have on the y-axis is total multi-year droughts, and on the x-axis is an index of spring moisture availability, which were determined to be key metrics for resources of interest in the park. Each dot on this graph is a different future climate projection, capturing the spread among different climate models and emissions pathways. Planners selected these four highlighted projections because they have relevant implications for management. They are divergent from one another, and so they help bracket that range of future conditions that managers could see. They're plausible in that they're based on physical models, and challenging in that they can spur creative thinking about futures that look very different from today. The next step is then to take these four climate futures and evaluate their ecological and resource implications, including vegetation changes and impacts on park operations under each scenario, which often involves a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. But what might we be missing in these assessments? Current approaches to scenario planning emphasize climate uncertainty in generating future scenarios, but may not explicitly integrate uncertainty in ecological responses to climate change. Importantly, it's difficult and often impossible to predict exactly how an ecosystem will respond to a given change in climate. Why is that? That lack of predictability derives from a number of factors. Ecological dynamics are complex and context dependent, and data are often limited to understand climate ecological relationships as well as the effects of interacting stressors or stochastic events. Additionally, our knowledge based on past and current observations of ecological dynamics may increasingly have less relevance as we move toward no analog future conditions. And so, from the perspective of developing scenarios that capture critical uncertainties relevant to management planning, we're arguing that we're liable to miss things if we don't consider that multiple ecological outcomes may be possible under a given climate future. And so this is the gap that we really sought to address through this project. Rather than having a one-to-one relationship between climate futures and resource implications, this project aimed at advancing the methodologies supporting scenario planning by developing principles and approaches to better integrate both climate and ecological uncertainties. And because this was a complex, challenging issue to tackle, we started out with a working group process to bring kind of collective expertise together in brainstorming ways to better integrate ecological uncertainty into scenarios. And in parallel, we're developing an applied case study in the Nebraska Sandhills to kind of test out and refine the approaches that we developed through our working group process. Together, this incredible team, including scientists from multiple federal agencies and universities, who have a wide range of expertise in ecological modeling and climate adaptation science, and a depth of experience developing and using scenarios. Many of these folks would consider themselves boundary spanners who connect the research and the management communities. This was just a great group of people to work with, so a huge thanks to them and to Angie Moline, who facilitated our workshop. You'll see a number of her illustrations peppered throughout the presentation today. And so we came together for several days of discussion and a series of virtual workshops. And distilling down our conversations gave us these three key principles or ingredients for ecological scenarios. First, a really careful consideration for exploring uncertainty in ecological dynamics. Second, a focus on trajectories of change through time rather than simply looking at end states of ecological change. And lastly, kind of stretching our thinking to look outside the box and anticipate impactful possible surprises. And so first was this focus on exploring uncertainties in ecological dynamics. For example, novel biotic interactions and feedbacks, unknown thresholds in responses to climate, and other ecological drivers that could create divergence among future scenarios. And scenario development does not need to explore variation in every one of these factors. That would be intractable. Rather, the focus is on those factors that are most uncertain and influential for ecological outcomes in a particular system, with transparency about which processes and assumptions are used as the basis for scenario development. And this can be really informed by developing or using conceptual models, such as state and transition models like the one pictured here, that summarize ecological relationships and provide information about drivers of transformation among ecosystem states. The second piece here is a focus on trajectories. When we're thinking about scenarios, we're often thinking in terms of future conditions at some point in time, several decades down the road. However, trajectory thinking requires considering the mechanisms of transformation and the pathways through which changes may unfold on intermediate timescales, which can be really useful for planning. It's not just that managers need to know what the ecosystem could look like in 30 or 50 years, but what they might see in the meantime and what triggers could lead to abrupt changes in ecosystem dynamics, which can help determine what to monitor and what levers they might have to shape outcomes. For example, under a given climate future, a fire could trigger different ecological trajectories in a particular location, depending on the characteristics of the pre-fire community, the fire itself, and the post-fire conditions, ranging from forest recovery to transition into a grassland state dominated by invasive species. And understanding these potential pathways can spur thinking about opportunities to intervene to avoid some of those undesired transformations. Lastly, we placed an emphasis on recognizing that we may face unexpected outcomes under novel future conditions, and that it's valuable to really explicitly stretch our thinking to seek out extreme scenarios, which can support adaptation planning that improves preparedness for surprising or consequential possibilities, essentially engaging in a kind of red team thinking. This might be done through creative visioning, benchmarking to past extremes to consider their potential impacts under future conditions or in combination with other events, and broadening the scope of analogs, for example, looking into paleo records to consider a wider range of possible ecological dynamics than what we see today. Given these three principles, our next challenge was thinking about how we can implement them in practice. We summarized this thinking into a course workflow for developing ecological scenarios, which represents a module that can be integrated into adaptation planning processes. This involves problem framing, identifying critical drivers, including climate and other factors such as socioeconomic forces or land use change, exploring ecological responses and trajectories, considering surprises, and finally, synthesizing ecological scenarios into a tractable set for managers to consider. And to provide a general framework to help guide scenario development and integrate these key considerations, but it's intentionally flexible and non-prescriptive so that it could be integrated into a wide range of existing planning processes. To kind of illustrate some elements of this workflow and how it could work in practice, we applied this retrospectively to an existing study of fire-catalyzed vegetation transformations in southwestern dry forests. I won't go into every detail of this study, but one of our co-authors, Jonathan Koop, used correlative models based on field observations of community composition change after past fires to develop projections for the future under distinct scenarios of future climate and fire severity. And we took these quantitative results shown in this bar plot, which is showing the percent change in trajectories toward forest or non-forest under future conditions. And we summarized these into a set of three ecological scenarios that could be used to explore adaptation strategies that would be robust across a range of future conditions and could be informed by post-fire vegetation monitoring. And so this is just one retrospective example. To make this a bit more practicable, we wanted to dig more deeply into the how of exploring ecological responses, which is really sort of the novel key piece of this. So what methods do we have in our toolbox? A number of existing approaches could be used to help develop ecological scenarios, including climate analogs, species distribution models, dynamic local vegetation models, expert elicitation, and more. But one of our key takeaways was that there really is no silver bullet when it comes to ecological modeling. Is a wide diversity of quantitative modeling frameworks to develop projections of future vegetation change or ecological change, each of which has its own assumptions and limitations. A single method that best lends itself to assessing plausible ecological futures, we came up with a range of methodologies that could be brought to bear in capturing ecological uncertainties, including general types of model structures, such as stochastic models that could be used to explore variation in ecological outcomes among model runs, as well as qualitative methods that could be used within the context of a participatory process involving managers and other experts. quantitative perspective, we considered how a given ecological response model could be used to consider multiple plausible futures driven by different assumptions, representing distinct what-if scenarios, rather than anticipating a single best guess for the future or quantifying uncertainty through a probabilistic framework. And in the global change ecology literature, projections of future ecological change often sit up here in this A and B space, or perhaps consider a couple of different emissions pathways, but they often do not fully explore a range of climate and ecological uncertainties through these types of what-if scenarios. We argue that both adaptation practitioners and ecologists can benefit from this type of carefully structured scenario thinking. And ecological modelers, in particular, can better support management by integrating this perspective of considering multiple futures through scenario-based thinking. For example, using multiple types of models together can help explore uncertainties and identify areas of agreement or divergence in ecological outcomes. This paper is a really nice one demonstrating this kind of multi-method approach. They focused on sagebrush ecosystems of the Western US and used 4 different ecological models, including both mechanistic and correlational model structures, with 10 different climate scenarios to evaluate sagebrush vulnerability under future conditions. Their analysis revealed agreement on the direction of change at range edges, but disagreement in sagebrush responses near the core of its temperature range. So using these multiple methods helped highlight some of the key sources of uncertainty, such as how recruitment and competition may change under future climate. And it provided quantitative results that could support development of a specific set of scenarios for adaptation planning. Additionally, while quantitative methods are undeniably valuable, no ecological model is likely to capture all relevant processes and nuances that may be of interest to planners. And uses of quantitative methods may often be limited by the availability of data or the capacity to apply those quantitative models. Qualitative approaches, in contrast, are common in scenario planning efforts, such as this example from Wind Cave National Park that I mentioned earlier, which generated this very detailed table of resource implications under different climate scenarios through a workshop process. These types of qualitative methods generally involve participation from managers and other experts that provides an opportunity for building shared understanding around climate impacts and creatively brainstorming adaptation options, which can also be combined with quantitative elements. One way of combining quantitative and qualitative perspectives is through what we're calling reverse engineering. This is an example from a paper about Tetland National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, led by one of our co-authors, Don Magnus, which assessed spatial analogs under future climate conditions at an ecoregion level to identify a range of plausible future ecological conditions for the refuge, including persistence as boreal forest, as well as transition into deciduous forest or grassland. Then, drawing on published research in the literature, they inferred what trajectories could lead to each of those possible outcomes, including the fire regime, climate conditions, and ecological processes that could trigger or stabilize a given ecological transition, such as drought or seed source failure after a fire, triggering a shift into a grassland state. And so putting this all together, this effort resulted in a set of principles, a general process, and a suite of tools for creating ecological scenarios, which are summarized in a new paper and an article we wrote for the conversation, if anyone is interested to read more. However, these examples I've described so far are retrospective. So mostly this still sits in a fairly abstract space and by no means addresses every challenge for crafting and applying ecological scenarios to inform planning and practice. So what's next to further this work? Future directions include continuing to build and advance the toolbox of approaches by addressing how existing ecological theory, data, and models can be leveraged alongside other sources of information, such as local and indigenous knowledge, to develop ecological scenarios. Second, we need new research in the areas of greatest uncertainty for anticipating ecological responses to climate change on management relevant timescales. And lastly, we need advancements in practical applications. One example of this could be pathway planning that uses information about plausible future trajectories to identify critical moments where management interventions could help direct ecological change along desired pathways. Additionally, we want to test drive our approach to work out kinks in a specific ecological and management context. And so I want to talk briefly about this case study in the Nebraska Sandhills, with the caveat that it is still very much in process. So this is all preliminary. And the Sandhills are a great place to work because they are one of the largest intact native grasslands in the world. This is a landscape of rolling dunes vegetated with mixed grass prairie, which occupies kind of a unique ecological space and is highly valued for wildlife habitat, ranching, and is a major recharge zone for the High Plains aquifer. And so, as part of this project, we worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages several wildlife refuges in and around the Sandhills, to explore potential impacts of climate change, ecological uncertainties, and implications for management. We started with setting the project scope by asking our partners to identify the grassland and wetland components of the ecosystem that they are most concerned about from a management perspective in terms of climate change impacts. They focused in on grassland plant diversity and structure, issues like eastern red cedar encroachment, and stability of the aquifer, which has implications for both wetland hydrology and aquatic vegetation, where they're dealing with some significant invasive species issues in the wetlands. And so focusing on these ecological features of interest, we brought in literature review, as well as input from partners and other experts to evaluate what aspects of climate each ecological feature is most sensitive to. This gave us a set of focal climate metrics to use to select future climate scenarios and summarize them. Excuse me one moment, I'm a little under the weather. And so taking these climate sensitivities, we explored the divergence among future climate projections in each of those focal metrics using biplots like this one, which has annual precipitation on the y-axis and mean annual temperature on the x-axis. We looked across a number of these biplots summarizing different aspects of future climate to select 4 projections capturing a wide range of future conditions. We summarize these as the scenarios on the right, representing a warm, wet, or least change future, an extremely hot and wet future, a climate future characterized by moderate seasonal changes but very dry summers, and an overall very hot and dry climate future. And so taking these climate summaries, we're now in the process of developing a set of future ecological scenarios that integrate both that future climate information and additionally brings in a consideration of ecological uncertainties. And so we started out this process by looking at historical trends and dynamics, including a sparser grassland state a century ago, and even further back in time, shifts between an open dune state and a grassland state like today's, to understand the range of past ecological conditions on this landscape. We then used a number of different sources of information to identify a set of future ecological scenarios and potential trajectories. which could be shaped by future climate conditions, management interventions, and extreme events. This range of futures included a transition into more of a woodland-dominated state, which is consistent with current trends and could depend on fire management, as well as the sensitivity of woody plant demographic rates to changes in climate and atmospheric CO2 concentrations. Staying in a grassland state is also plausible, but the species mix and potential for increases in invasive species issues likely depends on changes in seasonal moisture availability and growing season length, as well as management practices. Additionally, it's possible that the system could shift more towards a sparsely vegetated state under hotter and drier climate conditions, with devegetation and dune destabilization possible under a scenario with extended, extreme drought more severe than the 1930s Dust Bowl event. Such an outcome might be surprising if it occurred, but it's within the range of plausibility based on records of the past and future climate projections. And so this is where things stand right now. But this is still very preliminary, and we're working on refining a set of scenarios that capture more nuanced ecological responses and cover not only the grassland component, but also hydrologic and wetland impacts. We hope to additionally explore management implications in collaboration with our partners as their capacity allows. We're offering a call to action here for continuing to build this toolbox of approaches for crafting ecological scenarios. User-friendly tools like Climate Toolbox or similar platforms make climate data and projections accessible to managers and planners and provide workflows and case studies to help guide scenario-based applications of these tools. These are a critical resource for integrating climate uncertainty into planning and assessments in a systematic way that are increasingly being used by adaptation practitioners. However, similar tools are lacking for exploring ecological uncertainties in a systematic way. While the Climate Toolbox has a future vegetation tool that provides dynamic global vegetation model projections for a wide range of climate futures, which is just an incredibly valuable resource, this is still, from an ecological perspective, fairly coarse and represents only one way of anticipating future ecological responses. So the question is, what would a more comprehensive ecological futures toolbox look like? Could we develop a set of tools akin to Climate Toolbox that would make a wide range of ecological data sets and projections accessible for scenario planning applications, from process-based and Earth system model outputs to correlative approaches that can provide actionable long-range projections of ecosystem change under a range of future climates? For example, this is a mock-up of an idea for a tool that was developed by Helen Sofair at the USGS and Catherine Hegovich at UC Merced to demonstrate how existing variation in ecological conditions within a similar climate space could be exploited to explore a range of possible ecological outcomes under future climate conditions. And I won't go into too much detail about all of the aspects of what this tool would be, but it would show for a particular location what climate bin that place falls into and what biomes occur within the same climate bin globally. Then, looking forward, it would show the range of biomes that are associated with the future climate bin for that location, to explore variation in the ecological conditions that could occur under a given climate future for that place. And so this is one idea of the type of tool that may be particularly well suited to exploring future ecological scenarios. And I'll leave you with the question of, what else could we envision to help support scenario development for adaptation planning applications? And I want to end out here with this, which was a creative visioning exercise we did in our working group to imagine the potential impact of our contribution. We envisioned a future with sort of a better integration between the ecological modeling and the practitioner communities, in which research would really focus on understanding trajectories of change through time in response to climate change, and in which managers were better equipped to anticipate plausible ecological trajectories and recognize signals of emerging transitions as they encountered them. There's certainly a lot of work still to be done, but I think it really helps to have kind of an optimistic vision for what this could look like somewhere down the road. And so I'm going to end there and ask for questions.
Um, Thank you so much, Kira. That was fantastic, despite you being under the weather. Um, I do not see any questions in the chat, so I'm just inviting everybody to go ahead and unmute themselves and ask question. You feel free to chat, feel free to type questions in the chat as well, and I'll relay that to Kira. But yeah, at this point, you can unmute, share your video, and we can have a conversation. We have yeah, close to 20 minutes.
Yeah, I always talk faster when I'm actually in front of people. Came out a little shorter than expected.
It's a great speak. Uh, let's see your hand raised somewhere.
Yeah, I
Please go
have
ahead.
so thank you for the presentation and also for drawing my attention to your publication and also the conversation article, which I think is an interesting way to get the word out. Um, so these kinds of things are always really impressive pieces of work, and you just have an all-star team of people working on this. And I guess my question as a practical matter is how long does it take to go through this process? How many like brains do you have to have involved to do a good job in this sort of thing? And is it something that um, leads kind of, I'm guessing, I mean, asking what is kind of the time frame for getting to like uh, actionable information for managers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was something we really struggled with in our working group because certainly as you're adding additional layers to an assessment, like thinking about ecological uncertainty on top of climate uncertainty and other issues, that just adds more pieces to the puzzle, right? And makes it a bigger task. And so what we were envisioning was really thinking through what are some flexible ways and approaches that this could be done that could be kind of adapted to the level of capacity that one might have for a particular planning process. So certainly this could take an entirely qualitative approach and only use kind of existing resources out there and be done entirely within the context of these types of participatory workshops that are already common um, in scenario planning processes with just some sort of additional structure to thinking about, well, what are these other pieces of ecological uncertainty and sort of trajectories of change through time that we could layer in here. To sort of more comprehensive processes that might involve ecological modeling or at least sort of drawing on the literature to see what types of projections are already out there and what types of uncertainties they may already kind of represent. So that's why looking at multiple types of models can be useful if those are available for a particular place or application. Or sort of giving this call to action for ecological modelers more broadly to publish model results in a way that could lend themselves more directly into integrating into ecological scenario development by sort of considering this multiplicity of plausible futures rather than just sort of one best guess. And so this isn't really limited to the practitioner community. We need sort of everyone to contribute here.
If I could just one quick follow-up, there is a question in the chat too, but that I see. One of the things that makes this really useful for people that don't have the resources that you have there, I mean, drawing attention to the idea that there's more than one possible ecological response, and there's uncertainty in that, and not just climate scenarios themselves, I think is a step forward. But having like a library of case studies where people have worked it out, maybe using different levels of information and approaches would also maybe spur on, moving past seat of the pants, like we need to know what to do today with our budget sort of planning. Anyway, thank you. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and I think we would love to get there as we sort of continue to apply this in different sort of contexts of getting sort of that, what is that spectrum of sort of levels of effort in developing ecological scenarios and providing some case studies there. I think that's a great future direction.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob, for those questions, comments. Yeah, it's a question from Luis in the chat, like, will modeling be used specifically for ecological trajectories or also to plan management actions?
That's another great question. And another thing that we struggled with a little bit is, in general, sort of the development of scenarios themselves sets aside management responses to consider kind of what are the potential impacts of climate on the ecological system without that additional layer of if we change up our management response, what will that do? But in that process of sort of thinking through, well, given these scenarios, what are our adaptation actions that we could take? And how might they fare across these different scenarios? There are certainly opportunities to kind of integrate those management alternatives into modeling or into sort of thinking through scenarios as an additional layer. Yeah, Brian Miller actually has a great example of this from South Dakota of using state and transition simulation models with different sort of management alternatives and playing those out over future scenarios. I'll try to find the link for that to share, but that's a great question as well.
Molly, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kira. That was a really fantastic presentation. And yeah, I just want to commend all the work of the working group and yourself and kind of pulling all that information together and sharing it, not only in a really clear and concise way, but also with really nice imagery. So it's really always helps, I think, drive home an important point when you have some good images. So thanks so much for that. And then I guess my question is, I definitely I'm always, as a big fan of scenario planning, and yet also always recognizing that when you get scenarios that bifurcate into further scenarios, it gets overwhelming pretty quickly. And so you've touched already on that kind of challenge and how do we both make this practical, but also useful in terms of really taking, being able to leverage the benefits of a scenario-based approach while also making it practical. I was curious if you guys had seen examples from other sectors and other fields, knowing that scenario planning originated in, military and business sorts of settings, whether you also saw any examples or felt like you could take any inspiration from examples coming from those worlds where they might have had some first level drivers that were creating scenarios like parallel to the climate sort of scenarios and uncertainties around climate projections that then bifurcated into further scenarios, in this case, ecological for our sector. Have you seen examples of how other sectors have handled that and tried to make it more practical? Was that something you either saw examples of or feel like we have things to learn from?
That's another great question that I do not have a great answer to. Honestly, I have not dug into too many of the sort of specific examples from other fields. to be able to speak to that specifically. I know that sort of the traditional approach in scenario planning is to kind of generate two axes of sort of the factors that are of greatest uncertainty and relevance to outcomes, and then explore across the quadrants along those axes, what are the potential outcomes? And that's what they started with in Wind Cave, but found that it lacked plausibility a little bit because it wasn't based in those physical models of future climate projections. And so that's where that sort of biplot approach kind of came out of. But that's not to say that there aren't great examples in other fields that we just haven't come across yet in terms of, yeah, that issue of sort of additional layers of complexity, you know, continuing to branch out, and then the challenge of then synthesizing those back down into a really attractable set of scenarios or storylines to consider. One that we looked at a little bit from sort of the more disaster risk planning world was related to atmospheric river events in California. There was a really comprehensive sort of scenario planning exploration that was done there. And so that's one I would maybe point to look for. And that was, we sort of looked at as an example of that out of the box thinking of really sort of stress testing what would be the most impactful events and how could we respond under those scenarios. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a great example. And I'll look forward to and appreciate the team's dedication to trying to find sort of those opportunities to bring these tools into practical planning efforts. And hopefully all the various kinds of partners that we work with will also continue to have some of that flexibility or regain that flexibility to kind of test out some of these ideas, since that's where rubber hits the road in terms of figuring out what can work and be practical. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Molly, you raised an important point. Like, yeah, how do you develop a tractable set of scenarios that are, you know, divergent enough? But then who makes those decisions? You know, it's like it's just a scientist making those decisions. I think in our mind it's both scientists and practitioners and stakeholders are making that decision together when it comes to, yeah, those defining those 3 or 4 scenarios that they'll work with and develop planning for. I don't see any further questions. There's some comments in the chat. Gregor, go for it.
Yeah, just a simple one to sort of circle back on part of Kira's answer before, which I just sort of wanted to emphasize. Right, in response to Bob's question about, you know, a working group and how long does that take, that's certainly one way this could go. But the other way of just trying to alert the research community as to kind of the evolution of the practitioner community in terms of, okay, we got our arms around climate uncertainty, and now we're plunging in with ecological, I think is really great. And I, you know, I'm not on the researcher side anymore, so I don't know how realistic it is, but the idea of sort of this paper and this webinar, et cetera, just kind of broadcasting to the researcher community that this is how we do adaptation. And if you can, in your work, bring in both climate uncertainty and ecological uncertainty, that's a real plug and play product for managers to use in the context of the evolution that we're doing on the practitioner end. So I just wanted to kind of say that I appreciated, Kira, you mentioning sort of 2 different ways that this work can be applied. So more a statement than a question, but just wanted to kind of, you know, call that out as an important point. So thanks.
Thanks, Gregor. That was really well articulated.
Other questions, comments? Please don't be shy. Anything and everything is welcome. I know we have
I
some
left
great.
too much time. I could talk more if you all.
I see there are great minds here who've thought about similar things, the plausible uncertainty. So please, Louis, please.
I have a question. At the beginning, there was a slide about the divergence between, it was one of your early slides, between different modeling approach. It was a divergence of what? Species response to different climates or expected response? What was actually divergent? What was the thing that says this is different than that? Was it an ecological response? Was recovery from a seeding? Was it, what was it?
You want to share a slide here?
Yeah, let me see if I can find the slide you're talking about here. Was it, let's see.
It was before that. There was actually a formal graph with a maps, and the sagebrush system was red in the Southern Great Basin, and it was blue in the, the little dots and all that.
I think the slide with Katie Rennick's paper.
Yeah, I don't remember exact
You can
order
see.
of the,
Yeah.
but it was more at the beginning than that.
Oh, okay.
Oh, before that.
Oh.
There. So were these species abundance change expected on their climate change? Was it what was it the cover of sagebrush? Was it
Kira, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so it was like an index of sagebrush vulnerability because they were looking across some different modeling frameworks. It integrated, I think, recruitment and abundance, but I would have to look back at the paper to be 100% sure. But it's a measure of ecological response in terms of big sagebrush itself.
like a species distribution model prediction probably or something like that? Okay.
Yeah, so some of it, DGVM is like a dynamic global vegetation model, so it's predicting at a fairly coarse sort of ecological level. They had a demographic model that's integrating processes like recruitment. And then these two correlational response models are just taking like a vegetation response, like abundance, and correlating it with climate conditions. And they use two different data sets for that. So one is sort of using spatial gradients to develop those relationships, and one is using time series to develop those relationships. So those are the sort of different kind of methods they applied to this that each integrate different processes, either explicitly or implicitly. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Brian has also put the link to the paper in the chat.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Okay. Whoa.
Mhm. Perhaps one last question, comment, before we kind of move into a more informal session. Gregor.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing, more of a comment than a question, is that we more on the practitioner end for a number of years realized we were doing a good job with the climate stuff, and we're just not reckoning with the ecological uncertainty. We knew it was out there, but it kind of made our heads hurt, and we were busy just trying to get on with practicing. So really appreciate you, Kira, kind of grasping the nettle here and leading us through how to bring this in, because yeah, like I say, it was something we knew existed, but we were scared to touch it, and it's nice to be on the other side.
Thanks, Gregor, and yeah, everyone who was involved in this project for wrestling with that with us. It was yeah, it was a lot of deep thinking, and I feel like we got to something maybe useful.
Yeah, and thanks to North Central CASC for funding this effort and the CASC
Absolutely.
in general. Maybe one more, time for one more thought.
Sure, I'll jump in there for one more thought. Hey, Kira,
Great.
hey, MTS. Yeah, I just kind of going along with the first question that was asked, and this is just more of a comment, but this added complexity that we're wrestling with is certainly, you know, more to grapple with than just looking at climate scenarios alone. But I think the reward of that extra grappling is that you're going to have scenarios that are going to be much more relevant for managers. And I think I've seen situations where managers will have predictions of future precipitation or temperature change, and it's very difficult for them to then translate into what that means for the resources that they're managing and caring for. And in their heads, their analog might be, you know, wet, dry, or, you know, wet, hot or wet scenario. They'll think back to a year that was maybe hotter and wetter or something as sort of a closest analog. And a lot of times it's, all right, what does that mean? We survived that year. Maybe we'll be okay. I don't know. And so going that extra step to think about, you know, what the ecological transformations in vegetation communities or in, you know, distribution of wetlands or resources that they're managing, trying to make that link to resources that they're managing is, you know, really valuable. So I feel like the extra effort of trying to wrestle with this additional uncertainty has a really big payoff in that you're tying this to something that managers can really sink their teeth into more directly than maybe they can with trying to think about what 1 inch of rainfall additional might mean, or, you know, 2.3 degrees hotter or cooler. So, you know, it's complex, it's hard, but it's definitely worth doing because you're going to get to more relevant metrics for managers. So it's been great to be part of the team. Kudos to you for just keeping this moving and keeping the whole team moving forward and getting this paper out. I know that was a long road, so congratulations.
Yes, and thanks to everyone for patience with that long road and getting this out. Yeah, and that just reminded me of kind of one more point that I wanted to make just real quick here on just in terms of thinking through ecological scenarios and the relationship with climate futures. One of the points we wanted to make with the Sandhills example is that, you know, each of those different climate futures doesn't necessarily branch out into new ecological futures. Some of the same ecological responses could be plausible under multiple of these climate futures. And some of those trajectories are really dependent on some of these management interventions, as well as other sort of extreme events within the context of future climate. And so that it's not necessarily adding, you know, 5 more ecological futures for each climate future, but we're seeing some kind of convergence and divergence within this. So just to, yeah, I guess highlight that within the context of this particular example.
Well, we are at time now, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And please join me again in thanking Kira for this excellent presentation today. I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll move into an informal mode. And feel free to join if you want to have some more discussion. But again, thank you very much, and thanks again, Kira. See you next time.